In a course on the science of motivation, one has to deal with the issues of addiction. Addiction to chemicals, addiction to behavior, addiction to foods. These are highly motivating factors. Now, if you go into applied aspects of psychology and you're dealing with people on a daily basis, one of the first questions you're probably going to want to ask is, are you addicted to any kinds of chemicals? And what about the people around you? Do they have addictions? Because this kind of idea permeates people's life. You know, Ben Franklin said, many men think he is buying pleasure when he is really selling himself as slave to it. Addiction has been going on for a very long time, but how we understand addiction has changed quite a lot over the past 100 years. Let's just think about some statistics here about addiction. Well, this is the reason people go to hospitals. This is the reason people die, typically. It's because of abuse of behaviors and addiction. I'm getting these statistics from the CDC, which tracks drugs and drug use and drug addiction. About 18 million Americans have alcohol problems. About 5 to 6 million Americans have drug problems. These numbers, some of the drugs problems have gone up, like the opioids, and some have gone down, like cigarettes, nicotine, and even cocaine. But there's a lot out there about people having problems with these drugs. 23.5 million over the age of 12 need treatment for illicit drugs. Again, these are going to be big issues in the field of psychology as you go forward. Now, one of the things we've seen over the past few years is an increase in opioid use. Now, we're going to talk about opioids in the future, but we make our own opioids in our brain. These are analgesics. They reduce pain, but they can also be euphoric in some way. But what we'll find is they also produce high motivation in repeated drug taking. Now, overdose have increased over the past 14 years, according to the CDC. 60% of the drug overdose deaths involve pharmaceuticals. These are oxycodone, hydrocodone, methadone, some of these kinds of things. These are prescription drugs. And one of the problems we've seen recently is the fact that people get hooked on these painkillers, then the doctor takes them off and they go to heroin, which is an illegal drug, but it's also getting cheaper and cheaper. People also die from overdose of these drugs very often. Here's some more statistics from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and it looks at overall unintended deaths. Look at this increase. Now, I could only get the statistics up to 2008, but we know that it has continued. This is a real big problem because not only are these drugs addictive, but if used incorrectly, they are people produce overdoses for a number of reasons. This is the reason people go to emergency rooms. It's because of drug-related events. Cocaine, even marijuana can produce bad effects. Heroin, hydrocodone, which is again a type of opioid. Look at these numbers of people who went to the emergency room. These numbers come from the year 2011, but they're probably very applicable today. This is a great burden to our healthcare system. Tobacco, $96 billion. Overall cost, $193 billion. Alcohol, illicit drugs, these cost a tremendous amount of money to our emergency rooms and to our treatment centers. And when I talk about drugs, I'm going to talk about tobacco, alcohol, prescription drugs, illegal drugs. I'm going to look at them all the same because they are, in fact, chemicals that can, if used improperly, produce habitual use and abuse. This is also a tremendous burden on our criminal justice system. A lot of the reasons why people go to jail are drug-related. Either they are selling drugs, they are using illicit drugs, or they're committing crimes to get more drugs or money to get more drugs. More than half of Americans' federal inmates are in prisons on drug convictions. This is billions of dollars. We spend more money each year keeping people in prisons in California than we pay for students to be in college. This is a tremendous amount of money. The United States imprisons more percentage of its population than just about any other country. This is all back to drug abuse. Now, there was this big war on drugs, putting out this idea of these evil drugs out there. We've been at war with alcohol for a long time. We even tried to make it illegal back in the 1930s. That didn't work so well with prohibition. But we get this war on drug idea, and what happens is we get an explosion of prisoners. When you put people in prison, you pull them out of being productive members of our society, and again, it takes a tremendous amount of money to keep them in prison, not to mention the destructive nature that imprisonment has on families. But again, I want to look at all drugs. I mean, for example, this came out at CNN. They talked about a study that was done in England, and they ranked alcohol as the most harmful drug, even more so than crack and heroin. Alcohol is a kind of drug that's very hard to kick if you are addicted, and produces terrible withdrawals. And of course, we know that it impairs performance, and it's terribly damaging on the body. It's a legal drug, but it is extremely, extremely harmful. Here's another issue that people, I don't think, realize, and this is something that I want to have as an important part of this entire lecture on drugs. Drug relapse is the rule. Alcohol relapse, cigarette relapse, illicit drug relapse is the rule when it comes to drug addiction. Keep that in mind when you're dealing with people with drug problems. Relapse is the rule. Look at these statistics. Just in Alcoholics Anonymous, 81% are drinking again after 1 month, 90% after 3 months, and 95% after a year. This is not because they just stop coming to AA, it's because they relapse. And one of the most important things to understand is what causes relapse and how to get people back on a sobriety as quickly as possible. And not to look at people who try to be sober, try not to take the drugs, then relapse as a failure. It has to be about getting them back on to sobriety. Some of the drugs we're going to talk about in this lecture, we're going to talk about the opioids. We already talked about those a little bit. Cocaine, crack cocaine, these are variations. These are some of the club drugs. Methamphetamine is a terribly addictive drug. We'll talk about that. A little bit about marijuana, and also nicotine and alcohol. But what we're most interested in is not necessarily the drugs, but what motivates behavior to a point where taking the drug is disruptive and destructive to somebody's life, where we get to the point of addiction. Somebody having a glass of wine on a Friday night is not a problem. In fact, it can actually be a good thing. But when we get into cases where people are taking drugs and it's causing a great deal of damage, those are the things we must be interested in. First, let's talk about drug tolerance, because these have both chemical and psychological components that intertwine. Tolerance is simply a person taking more drug to get the same effect. Now, that effect can either be the effect of the drug or the effect of of reducing the motivating properties of that drug. Higher and higher doses and to receive the same effect. I want to talk about two types of tolerance: physical tolerance and psychological tolerance. So with physical tolerance, the body is trying to keep homeostasis. We'll talk about homeostasis later on, and that's this balance, a balance on many parts of our body, but it also tries to keep a balance on receptors, on neurons, and number of neurotransmitters released. It tries to keep that balance. And what it does is it upregulates and it downregulates. For example, if it upregulates, it means of a neurotransmitter, it's creating more neurotransmitters. The neurons are creating more, trying to get it back up. But we can also have down regulation. That's where it reduces the number of neurotransmitters or then reduces the number of receptors. And that can happen when somebody is taking drugs that mimic those neurotransmitters. So the brain thinks it has too much of that neurotransmitters and will down regulate. Let's review the neuron really quickly. So this is a neuron, and we have the dendrites bringing information in. We have the axon sending information away to the terminal end, and action potentials bounce down from node to node and help release neurotransmitters at this end. So here's that action potential bouncing down, causing the release of neurotransmitters at the terminal end of the axon. Once it gets down, we're going to release neurotransmitters. Now, this is the synapse right here. This is very important. This is where neurotransmitters are released across this space known as the synaptic cleft and affecting postsynaptic neurons. Now, causing this neuron to fire more or fire less. But most drugs are affecting this area right in here, right in the synapse. So here's my kind of crude drawing. Neurotransmitters released across the synaptic cleft and fitting into these receptors like a key fits into a lock, okay? And affecting this neuron, maybe making it fire more or fire less. An upregulation of a presynaptic neurotransmitter would be to create more neurotransmitters. More neurotransmitters, the greater the likelihood that the neurotransmitter will find the postsynaptic cell. You can also have a down regulation. Maybe you are taking drugs that increase the amount of dopamine or morphine or something. So the neurons try to reduce that number because you're taking this exogenally. You can also have a down regulation of postsynaptic receptors. Again, this is trying to keep a homeostasis. So, for example, let's say somebody is taking oxycodone, which mimics our own opiates. So, too many of the receptors are being activated. Reduce that number, and they're not activated as much. So let's go and take a look at some morphines. Let's take a look at an oxycodone or hydrocodone or heroin. So we have these endogenous opiates in our brain. And what happens is that there are some plants out there, like poppies, that can make chemicals that mimic them, that look like them and act like them, and affect receptors like our own endogenous, in our own brain, opiates. I'm just throwing this example out to try to give it some numbers, to kind of think about it. Let's say the normal activity means that 70% of the neurotransmitters find receptors. If everything is working in this nice balanced way, that's how it works. But if one takes morphines, then let's say now 95% of the receptors are activated because they're activated by our own opiates and they're activated by this chemical that a person takes. Now 95% are activated and the person feels euphoric. So the postsynaptic cell begins to try to get back to that 70%, tries to get back to that balance. So it begins to downregulate the postsynaptic receptors, reduce the receptors, and suddenly now the system isn't as activated. If someone then stops taking the morphine and the postsynaptic cell is downregulated, there's not as many receptors, well, now the system isn't working hardly well at all, and people feel pain, people feel withdrawal. It's a really bad thing. Keep in mind that drug tolerance and withdrawal doesn't really have a strong connection with addiction, and we'll get to that. So, here's my example. Neurotransmitters released, maybe an opioid, and it affects it, then it's super activated by these morphines that someone takes. Now look at all these extra receptors that are activated, and this neuron is super activated. So we remove some of the receptors so this system doesn't get as activated when one takes morphines. We remove those, and now if there are no morphines, this system is not activated very well. You have a low level of activation, and the person goes through withdrawals. So you need to take more and more of the morphines in order to account for the fact that you have a reduction in receptors or a reduction in neurotransmitters. But what about psychological tolerance? This is very specific to cues. This is Pavlovian. This is classical conditioning. A major part of tolerance, though. So this is a learned phenomenon. It does affect physiology. All learning affects physiology, just in a different way. And it's also very time specific. It's not just a downregulation that takes place all the time. The tolerance is specific to the situation. This is classical conditioning. It's called a conditioned compensatory response. A conditioned compensatory response. It's classical conditioning that compensates for something. Classical conditioning causes the body to compensate for the expected drug. So how does the brain know when a drug is coming? It does that through classical conditioning. This is not conscious. So, if a person who takes heroin, injects heroin, and they take it in the same place all the time, there are cues there that tell the brain the drug is coming. The paraphernalia of the drugs, the needle, the environment, the smells in the room, these are all cues to the brain that the drug is coming. Environmental cues become a conditioned stimulus, a CS. That goes to the brain. The brain does not want to have all those morphines in the body and in the brain. It sees it as kind of a poison. So it sends a signal down to the liver in an attempt to have the liver release metabolites that help break down those morphines. So if somebody is beginning to take out the needle, they're taking out the drugs, they're in their environment, the brain sends a signal to the liver releases these metabolites, now these are floating around in the blood, and when somebody goes to take the drug, these metabolites are there to break it up, to break up these morphines that they see as poison. So somebody has to take more and more. The heroin addict takes a higher and higher dose, and that's key, of the drug, because more of it is broken down by these conditioned release metabolites. If, however, they take the same high dose and the compensatory response isn't there, in other words, the brain didn't know the drug was coming, this is not a conscious thing, this is a classical conditioning subconscious thing. They take it in a new environment. People tend to overdose in unfamiliar environments because there isn't the level of compensatory response. So there isn't as much of the drug broken down, more of the drug gets to the brain, and the person overdoses. So here's the example. Okay, a rather crude example. Somebody's taking morphine in their log cabin. Again, crude example. And they take more and more because when they go there, they take out the needles, there's the environment of that log cabin. The brain knows, okay, the drug is coming, I need to do something to counteract it. I have a compensatory response. But they have to take more and more and more of the drug, higher doses. But let's say they take it in a new environment, somewhere new, where there aren't the classical conditioning stimuli there. And the brain doesn't know the drug is coming. Oh, sure, the needle's there and a few other things are there, but not the same level, not the same amount of stimuli. They take the same high dose, and they overdose. Okay, again, a very crude example, not very sensitive. I'm going to throw this out there just so we can think about numbers. These have nothing to do with what drugs people actually should take. I'm just making up numbers here. But let's say somebody is taking this amount of drug in blue. That's the dose they take. But the one in red here is how much gets to the brain. And let's say that spot right there is an overdose level. But they're not taking an overdose level when they start, but they begin to take more and more. But look how much gets to the brain because of the compensatory response. Suddenly, in a new environment here, more of it gets to the brain because they're taking such a high dose, and they're not in the same environment. They take too much, and they overdose. That's a conditioned compensatory response. So let's get away from tolerance and get into addiction. Now, there's a little bit of overlap there about what's happening. Addiction and tolerance have some common elements. But let's go over some theories. I'd like you to know 3 theories of addiction. 2 of them aren't very good theories, and the last one is pretty good. One is the physical dependence problem. They are tolerant to the drug, and if they stop taking the drug, then they go through withdrawals, and they feel bad. This idea is called the negative reinforcement theory, and the idea is they take drugs to avoid feeling bad. They start feeling bad because of withdrawal, and they start taking it again. Okay, so some of you might have take caffeine a lot. Okay, so you drink a lot of caffeine, and you drink it every day, and all of a sudden you forgot to drink your caffeine, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What happens? You start getting headaches. You start feeling a little bad. So that might motivate you to take more caffeine. The idea behind the negative reinforcement theory is that drugs are taken to counteract withdrawal, and the way to deal with that is to have them withdraw slowly, a gradual withdrawal, so that the withdrawal symptoms aren't really bad all at once. But this has some problems, this negative reinforcement theory. Some highly addictive drugs like cocaine don't have really severe withdrawals. They're bad, but they're not jonesing bad. They're not throwing up bad. But these are highly addictive. Same with nicotine. Nicotine, you kind of feel crappy, but you can deal with them, but they're still highly motivating drugs to take. And we also see that patterns of drug taking, even with people who take it a lot and maybe even abuse it, because of financial reasons or job reasons or social reasons, they don't take them every day. They binge. They take them, and then 2 weeks later they take a whole bunch, and then a week later they take a whole bunch. Well, they would be going through withdrawals all those times in between drug taking, and so that should be motivating their behavior, and it doesn't. So the pattern of drug taking doesn't, in many people, doesn't really coincide well with the idea of withdrawal. And there's not a lot of good experimental evidence when we bring people into the lab, give them questionnaires, or even run experiments with animals. I mean, one of the main factors is that people relapse well after the withdrawals are gone. So you stop drinking alcohol, and you go through these terrible withdrawals, and you're terribly sick, and a week goes by, and you feel a little better, and 2 weeks go by, and you're not feeling that. You're not feeling that terrible withdrawal. Still highly addicted, though. Still highly motivated to take the drugs without the withdrawal. Weak subjective reports of withdrawals and craving. We're going to get to that word here in a moment, the idea of craving. Thinking about trying to get that drug. It doesn't really correlate well with the notion of withdrawal. I'm not saying withdrawal isn't a motivating factor. What I'm saying is, isn't a complete theory. So, people and animals will self-administer opioids in the absence of withdrawal symptoms or physical dependence. We can check this with what's known as a naloxone challenge, which is blocks opioids, and so even though what the naloxone challenge does is test to see if people are going through withdrawal from opioids, and it can show that they're not, and yet they're still motivated to take the drugs. We still have high levels of relapse. Some drugs can produce withdrawals, like tricyclic antidepressants, but they're not abused. They don't have that motivating component to take the drug. And also, this notion of craving, the really, really strong desire to get the drug, to take the drug, oftentimes occurs after the withdrawal symptoms are gone because you just took the drug. When the drug is producing a subjective pleasure, there's still that real strong craving. We're going to get into the notion of craving here in a little while. And again, relapse often occurs even months after the withdrawal symptoms have gone away. And then there's a theory known as the positive reinforcement theory of drug addiction, and this has to do with the rewarding nature of drugs. Drugs are taken because drugs are pleasurable. They're rewarding in the pleasurable sense. They make you feel good. You have a positive emotion or affect, euphoric. And this, I think, is a really misunderstood thing about drug addiction, that drug addiction is all about pleasure and pleasure centers of the brain, and we're going to get past that a little bit in this class. Some of the problems with this is that there is not a real good direct correlation between a drug's euphoric effect and its addictive potential. Some drugs, for example, like nicotine, don't produce this euphoric pleasure. Oftentimes, opioids are dysphoric. They can make you sick. They don't feel good when you take them. A lot of times people don't say that they get pleasurable aspects from their drugs. That's everything from alcohol to heroin, that they don't get the pleasure from it anymore, either because of tolerance or it just doesn't make them feel good, and yet they're highly motivated. It seems counterintuitive, but that's the case. And then there's just the rationale. People know what these drugs can do to them. They can be rational about what happens to them if they relapse and they take the drug. They can be rational about it, and they can say that the bad far outweighs the good. They lose their family, they lose their job, they have no respect, they do things, they do behaviors that they find to be terrible behaviors, abhorrent behaviors, and yet they're still highly motivated to take the drug. This isn't a rational thing, okay? So the notion that drugs are taken because of pleasure isn't really a very good theory. I'm not saying it's not a motivating factor. I'm just not saying it is a strong motivating factor. So let's look at this experiment by Lamb et al. They were asked to self-administer drugs, and in this case, report how pleasurable they were. These were morphines. These are opiate post-addicts who press a lever to get an injection of a low dose of morphine. Very, very low dose. So low that the people in the study say, well, this will have no effect on me. I know how much I used to take. And they actually had to press the lever a lot. It wasn't just pressing it a few times. It was several hundred times. And 4 out of 5 could not distinguish whether they were getting the drug or they were getting placebo, a saltwater solution. They couldn't tell the difference. But the placebo didn't maintain lever pressing the next day, but the ones that got the opioids did. In other words, they couldn't tell what group they were in, but the ones that got the salt water the day before, they didn't press the lever. The ones that got the opioids the day before, they pressed the lever to get injected. Okay? So we need to get away from the notion that drugs are a pleasurable thing, and that's why they're motivating. They have that quality, some of them do, but that's not the primary focus when thinking about addiction. We also need to get the difference between liking a drug and wanting and craving. Okay? So we can get classical conditioning of euphoric highs. People, sometimes they can just, if they don't have the money, they can just inject themselves with maybe water, and they can get that kind of euphoric high. But people also say that craving is what is conditioned. It is not the pleasure, it is the wanting. This is an interesting thing to try to disentangle. You can want something so badly, crave it so badly that that's all you think about, and not really find it pleasurable. And we're going to discuss that more. In rats, morphine can motivate behavior, but can also act as a US and conditioned food version. In other words, give them food and inject them with morphine. Give them food, inject them with morphine. They'll still press a lever to get the morphine, but they won't eat the food anymore because the food is associated with something that makes them sick. So what I want to really get across here, and this is something very important, is that the motivation for drug, the part of the brain that motivates this behavior, that seeks out this behavior, that causes the craving and the wanting, is not necessarily connected with the part of brain that perceives pleasure, that it's a pleasure motivating system. Very important, especially with this next theory. So let's just go back over some of these theories. Negative theory, people are taking drugs, motivated to take drugs because they want to counteract withdrawal, they want to counteract badness. And the positive theory is that they take drugs because drugs make them feel good, make them feel high. Certainly components to drug taking and drug relapse, but not a complete theory, okay? Because we have people taking drugs when they are not feeling the withdrawals, the pleasures can go away, the badness far outweighs the good, those kinds of things. So what are we left with? Some other theories. So this is one theory I'd like to talk about. It's called the incentive sensitization theory of drug addiction. Repeated drug taking results in persistent changes in the neural system that mediates craving of the drug. We're going to get to the part of the brain motivated by the drug, motivated by the behavior, that causes a person or an animal to seek out that drug, to rationalize it, to think about it, to do whatever it can to get the drug. We call this the incentive salience of the drug, not the pleasure. Now the incentive salience, and we're going to get to this in greater detail, has a lot to do with the stimuli associated with the drug. This is, in other words, the motivation, the craving comes about when somebody sees an alcohol bottle or sees friends that they do drugs with or things like that. We'll get into that with greater detail. So the brain areas are linked with the motivation, is sensitized to the drug and stimuli that precede the drug. The brain learns. This is a very psychological process. So it's a motivating system. It's a motivating system that for some people doesn't have a ceiling effect. In other words, it just doesn't motivate them little. It motivates them where they can't do anything else. It becomes hypersensitive to the drug in some cases, and hypersensitive to the stimuli associated with the drug. This sensitivity is long-lasting, far past withdrawals. This can go on for years, and it produces craving. And I'm not talking about craving in the sense of, boy, I'm really craving a cheeseburger, or I'd like some chocolate. I'm talking about what psychologists call invasive thoughts. They get into the brain, they can't get out. And that's all you do is you think about it and you rationalize it and you do whatever you need to do in the conscious brain to get that drug. And a small amount of drug can prime this area again. People haven't taken the drug for a long time. They've been off it. They're really good. Let's say an alcoholic. And all of a sudden they have a glass of wine at a wedding. Now that area is primed again because it's hypersensitive and relapse can occur. Now, the part of the brain that's involved in this, there are many parts of the brain involved with this, but I'd like to focus on one system. It's called the mesotelencephalic dopamine system, sometimes called the mesolimbic or mesocortical, depending on what book you read. This starts in the mesencephalon, deep in the brain, deep in the brainstem, and projects up into the telencephalon, into the forebrain. It plays an important role in what's known as intracranial self-stimulation. In intracranial self-stimulation, you put an electrode deep down into a rat's brain. You put it along this system, anywhere along this system. And if the rat presses a lever, it self-stimulates inside its brain. It stimulates this area. Press the lever, stimulate the mesotelencephalic dopamine system. And in many cases, the rats will press that lever and do nothing else. They'll press that lever, and they'll press that lever, and they'll press the lever, and they can die doing it. They'll forego food, they'll forego sex, they'll forego water. That's a highly motivating system. These are dopamine cells. Dopamine plays an extremely important role in addiction. Most drugs that cause addiction or behaviors that are addictive increase dopamine levels. This is dopamine cells projecting into the telencephalon. The two areas that I'd like you to know about is the substantia nigra, which is a dopamine cell, down in the mesencephalon, and the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. The VTA is really the big one. It's the most important of the two. The substantia nigra plays a role, but the VTA is the big one. Okay, so this is a picture of a rat's brain. And here's the substantia nigra, and here's the VTA projecting up into the forebrain. Now we're going to get to an area called the nucleus accumbens. Increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and you have yourself an addictive behavior or an addictive drug. Increase dopamine activity in the nucleus accumbens, and you have addiction. These are just some other pictures of where the substantia nigra is found. Projecting, it has several projections. Substantia nigra plays a big role in just motor movement. It projects up into the caudate nucleus. But we're looking at it as a motivating factor. Here's the VTA again, projecting up. Here's the substantia nigra projecting up to the motor area, but it also plays some other roles here, up into the nucleus accumbens. Another picture, VTA, up to the nucleus accumbens, and then up into the forebrain, the prelimbic. Now think about this. Your forebrain is really the part of the brain, the frontal lobe, the prefrontal lobe. It's the part of the brain that helps you plan things, helps you get out of bed and plan your day, and makes you have decisions to do things. It motivates you to do stuff at a conscious level. But deep down in the brain, whispering to the frontal lobe is the nucleus accumbens and the VTA, and telling it what it should be doing. The frontal lobe is rationalizing it. Yeah, okay, I'll do that. The VTA and the nucleus accumbens is projecting up and motivating it. Okay? Highly sensitive to drugs. VTA, nucleus accumbens, up to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is a slave in many ways to the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens is motivating behavior. You know, this is a very important system, the VTA. When you first fall in love, your VTA is kicking off when you see the person you're in love with, right? So you get addicted to them, so you want to be near them. It's really important in food and water and sex and all these things that help an animal to survive, extremely important. What happens is we have some drugs that get into that area and motivate that behavior as well in many people. So addictive drugs can be quite different in their action and where they affect the brain and their neurochemistry, but ultimately, one way or the other, either directly or indirectly, they're going to increase dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens. Okay? So amphetamines, cocaine, alcohol, even THC in marijuana, these are all things that move to increase dopamine levels. Some at different levels, some at different speeds. One of the keys to addiction is increase dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens as fast as you can, and you're going to get a very addictive drug. Methamphetamine does that terribly fast. So some drugs induce the release of presynaptic dopamine from presynaptic terminals. So you take a drug and it increases dopamine. Other drugs block the reuptake into the presynaptic terminal. In other words, if a dopamine cell coming from the VTA is releasing dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, that dopamine is sucked back in sucked back in and doesn't make its way over. Some of it makes its way over, some of it's sucked back in. If you block that, like cocaine blocks dopamine from being pulled back in, then you have something that increases dopamine, like cocaine does. Others affect the substantia niger or VTA. And what I want to point out is even cannabinoids that are found in marijuana can do this for some people. I know marijuana is getting a better rap. I don't see why not. Alcohol is a much more dangerous drug, in my opinion. But we also can't say that marijuana is completely devoid of being addictive. It can be addictive, probably just not to the same levels as some of the others, but we do know that it increases dopamine. Marijuana increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, and for some people it can be very addictive. And some act through a second system. It affects something that affects dopamine. Like opioids, for example, alcohol. Opioids, alcohol, a few others, they affect drugs that might inhibit dopamine release. So if you stop a neurotransmitter from stopping dopamine, you increase dopamine. And that's what a lot of these opioids do and alcohol does. So a lot of this work and my lecture comes from a very important study by Robinson and Berridge. They've had other papers since then. I think I posted it. You can read it, you can look over it if you'd like. But it was a very pivotal study, and they've come out with other research since then on the incentive sensitization theory of drug addiction.